welcome, folks. Thanks so much for joining us in this second in our webinar series for Schools of Substance. My name is Richard Cash. I'm Head of Service Development here at 360 Edge, and we're the lead organisation behind the Schools of Substance initiative. So I'm going to introduce our speakers for today in just a moment and set the table for the structure of the webinar. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we meet this afternoon. We recognise the ongoing impact of dispossession on First Nations people and the importance of their connections to land and sea and community. And we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people that are joining us. So it'll come as a surprise to no one that vaping is a pretty hot topic. As a way of using nicotine, vaping is very new. And schools have had to respond pragmatically to this issue. Often behind the science or the public health messaging has caught up with the actual behaviour that's going on in the world. So today we're going to talk about recent research, what we really know about vaping, and most importantly, what works in schools to support young people to make the best choices about their health today and in future. And we're very lucky to be joined by two esteemed experts today. From 360 Edge and the National Drug Research Institute, we are joined by Professor Nicole Lee. Nicole's a psychologist, a researcher and a policy expert with almost 30 years experience. She has a passion for making sure research is translated into effective policy and practice. Also joining us is Dr. Lauren Gardner from the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. Lauren's PhD is also psychology, and her research interests focus on scalable, preventative e-mental health interventions for secondary school students. And we're going to hear more about those interventions today. So we have some insights to share, but we're really keen to hear from you. We've set aside some time for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. If you've got any questions or comments, please use the Q&A window in your Zoom app. And if you want to say hi and let us know where you're from, please feel free to use the chat window. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nicole Lee. Professor Nicole, what do we really know about vaping?
Thanks, Richard. I think we're not quite on the right slide there.
Oh, sorry. Let me go back one.
Thank you. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Richard said, it's no surprise that this is a hot topic. It's been in the media a lot over the last couple of years, and we certainly know that vaping can cause harms for young people. Some of those harms we know are causal, things like nicotine dependence in the mid to long term, but there's also more immediate risks like toxicity issues. But causal doesn't mean inevitable. So not everybody who vapes develops dependence or experiences toxicity, but there is a causal risk for some of these harms. And some of the harms are, at this stage, just correlations. We don't really know the causal direction. So it might be that teens with poorer mental health are more likely to vape rather than the other way around. Or it might be that some teens have some particular characteristics that make them more likely to both smoke or vape. So yes, but we do know that they do cause a range of harms. We know that vaping is significantly less harmful than smoking cigarettes. So next slide, Richard. Thank you. But for those who aren't trying to quit, for teens and also for adults, it's safer not to do either smoking or vaping. So I think we can all agree that it's safest for teens not to vape or smoke at all, and that's kind of ultimately what we're aiming for in terms of prevention and what we'll be talking about today. So we know that this is data actually from Lauren's work and centre, but we know that around 1 in 4, 26% of teens have tried vaping, and about 6%, 1 in 20 vape regularly. This is really consistent with a range of other data that we've got as well. So you can see that a relatively small proportion of people who try it go on to use it more regularly. And just incidentally, the majority of teens that smoke regularly are dependent. So we can probably assume that's the same for that 6% of regular vapers as well. We know that 4.5% of teens are considered current smokers. So they've had a cigarette in the last month, and regular smokers make up about 3% of that 4.5%. So it's about 70% overall regular smokers. And teen smoking rates have also been increasing at the same time that teen vaping rates have been increasing. So those two things might be related, or there might be something driving both of those increases. We don't really know at this stage. So about 1 in 10 teens vape and smoke as well. And Lauren's research has shown that it's more common in the teenage group than any other age group. So what that tells us is that we don't need to panic about vaping, but it is a problem that is growing and can grow further if we don't put effective measures in place. So this idea of teen vaping is relatively new. We don't have a heap to guide us on what to do that's specific to vaping, but we do have decades of research and a lot of knowledge about what works in relation to other drugs, and we apply the same principles across a range of drugs. So we apply that as well to vaping. We know that zero tolerance type approaches like suspending kids or expelling them are not effective in helping students, particularly those with problems. And in fact, experts view the containment of the school environment to be a protective factor for kids at risk. So it's kind of the opposite of that. Zero tolerance seems like, sometimes it seems like it might be a neat solution, but it doesn't actually stop the behaviour for a start. It just shifts it away from school, and it doesn't necessarily help the person who's vaping. And we know from other drugs that crackdowns and hardline approaches just tend to drive behaviour underground, and so it becomes actually harder to manage, and it can become more entrenched. So some of those things that we are seeing in the US, like security guards and alarms and those kinds of things in response to vaping and other drugs, just really create a punitive school environment to respond to an issue that affects a relatively small proportion of kids. And we know from other drug prevention efforts that there are much better ways to reduce use and to reduce the issues for schools, and of course for parents as well, and at the same time to assist young people who are already using. So the first strategy that I just wanted to refer to is normalising non-use. So remember this slide. The 1 in 4 have tried it, 1 in 20 vape regularly. But if you flip that around, you can, if you kind of think of it the other way, 74% of teens have never tried vaping and 94% don't vape regularly. So the vast majority of teens don't vape. And I know at the moment it feels like everybody's doing it and it's everywhere, but the reality is that the majority of kids are not, and they actually don't want to. But if we talk about vaping all the time and we talk about everybody doing it and we emphasize the problems, the kids believe that everyone's doing it, and then they're more tempted to try it themselves. Vapes have been around in Australia actually for about 20 years. only becoming popular in the last few years, but we really started to see that spike in teen vaping when it started to appear in the media and everyone started to talk about it just after the government's kind of first major initiative to respond to vaping. Now, that's a correlation, not a causation, but it's likely that at least some of that increase is due to the sense that vaping is everywhere and everyone's doing it. So the first thing is that we want to normalise non-use. We want to communicate that most people don't vape, most teens don't vape, and we need to communicate that to the school community. The second area is in the same way as for other behavioural problems in the school setting, we need to develop clear policies and procedures that set clear consequences for the behaviour, which is vaping in this case. We need to make sure that that's well communicated through the school community, including to parents. And the most important thing is to reinforce those consequences and manage that behaviour as it occurs. So we know from behavioural psychology that consistent application of consequences and rules is more important than just having the rule. If you just have the rule and you don't enforce it, then the behaviour usually just continues. Some of the kind of straighty 180 kids will follow rules without consequences, but the kids at risk are less likely to for a range of reasons. In all likelihood, you've got procedures in place for smoking and probably for alcohol and other drugs as well. And the vaping policies and procedures will be in line with those, if not very similar or identical to those. And we don't need to do anything particularly different for vaping than for other drug problems. So if someone was found vaping on school grounds, for example, whatever you say is the consequence in your policy, the consequence needs to be applied consistently. And you don't want policies that are too harsh to apply consistently or too lenient that they're not a reinforcer. The third area is creating a healthy school environment. When we create an environment at school or at home that is kind of makes vaping less compatible, or in fact smoking, alcohol and drug use as well, we reduce the risk that kids and teens will use. So promoting healthy activities, ensuring there's not a lot of unstructured free time, making sure that there's a lot of good supervision without necessarily helicoptering, but making sure that especially young teens are well supervised. We know from the research that kids who are engaged in lots of structured supervised activities are less likely to try any type of drug, including alcohol and tobacco. And then we need a system for managing anyone that has problems. So options, making sure that there's easy referral options for intervention, for treatment, for family sessions, either at school or good referral networks outside of school. But the most important thing is to educate teens. It's not only is it effective in preventing and reducing teen use if it's done in the right way, but it sets them up for life with good attitudes and good skills right through their adult life when they encounter alcohol and other drugs. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren to talk about some of the best practice education programs that are available.
Thank you, Nicole. So that's exactly right. My team at the Matilda Centre at the University of Sydney have really focused on this school-based prevention for that reason. And so that's because, we think that school is that ideal location. So it's practical. Students are spending over 25% of their waking lives there. We can get in and reach students at the time when they first start to experiment with alcohol and other drugs. It allows us to educate prior to that harmful exposure. We can tailor our messages for different developmental levels. And of course, with substance use education being mandatory within the health education curriculum, we can provide programs that are a direct replacement for regular education programming. Next slide, please, Richard. So over the past few decades, there have been a number of reviews and meta-analyses conducted to try and tease out what it is that makes one school-based prevention program more effective than another. And what we found from these reviews is this set of effective principles of school-based drug prevention. So we know that the most effective programs are those that are evidence-based and theory-driven. We know it's those that are developmentally appropriate and immediately relevant to students. So young people typically are most interested in something that's going to affect them in the here and the now, not really what's going to happen to them in 20 years' time. We know that we have to implement programs early prior to the harmful use, and that programs are most effective when they're part of a comprehensive health education curriculum. We also know that using peer leaders increases the effects of a program, but we do still want to keep teachers within a central role. We know that interactive teaching methods are typically more engaging and effective than those traditional didactic or lecture style methods. And finally, we know that programs that adopt a social influence or comprehensive approach to prevention are most effective. So this involves providing young people with information and facts on the harms, along with resistance skills training, but we also incorporate normative education. So like Nicole spoke about before, it's challenging that view that everyone is doing it, so I'm the odd one out for not trying it, because that can obviously encourage young people to use, but flipping that on its head to show actually you're not. You're not in the minority, you're in the majority, and most people aren't actually using alcohol or other drugs. Next slide, thank you. So at the Matilda Centre, we've capitalised on those effective principles, and we've developed a range of programs to prevent and reduce substance use. So these are 3 of those programs that form part of the School of Substance suite. And these have all undergone rigorous evaluations via randomised controlled trials. So that's generating the gold standard level of evidence. So these were covered in detail in the last Schools of Substance webinar, so you can revisit that for more information. But just as a brief recap, we've got Our Futures. So that one is a digital program. Sorry, I'll go back to the remaining slide because I'll still need to talk to Preventure. Thank you. So that program is delivered to a full year group or a school. We have a suite of different modules addressing alcohol, cannabis, MDMA, other illicit drugs, and most recently we've developed and we're trialling a vaping module. So that will be my focus in this talk, so I won't go into more detail just yet. But we also have Preventure. So that one is a brief face-to-face program that's targeted towards students who are deemed as at risk of substance use. And that risk assessment is based on personality traits. So students receive a program from trained facilitators. It's based in motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioural techniques, and it's tailored to those personality traits. Then finally, the Illicit Project. So that one provides education grounded in neuroscience and harm reduction to older adolescents. So the content's really tailored to the developmental needs of 16 to 18-year-olds to ensure that that can effectively engage and educate students at that age. So it's really looking at how the brain develops and responds from that neuroscience perspective, which young people do find quite interesting and engaging. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I predominantly work on Our Futures research, including the new vaping module. So I'll take a deeper dive. And this is a universal evidence-based prevention education program for secondary school students, aiming to empower them to make positive choices to improve their health and well-being. So by universal is what I mean by delivered to all students in the classroom, regardless of their level of risk. So this program currently consists of 5 curriculum-aligned modules that have been developed and rigorously evaluated. They've gone through an iterative co-design process with students and teachers, and we continue to update and refine them over time. So we've got the alcohol and cannabis and psychostimulants, MDMA and emerging drugs, and mental health modules. The mental health module is recommended to be delivered in combination with the alcohol and cannabis module for best effects. So ideally, all of these modules would be delivered sequentially, but they can be delivered individually based on schools' needs. And importantly, they all adopt a harm minimisation and that comprehensive social influence approach that I spoke about. So providing that evidence-based information, the resistance skills training, and that normative education. Next slide. Okay, in terms of the structure of each module, so each one has 4 to 6 lessons, with the main component of each lesson being these interactive cartoon storylines. So students typically view these individually on their own computer, but some teachers do opt for going through them as a class. And we embed characters who are around the same age as the target students. So we're really delivering these peer-led messages, which we know are more effective at driving behaviour change than having the messages come from an authority figure, like a police officer. We also touch on topics such as love interests and teenage dramas to really engage students. Then we've got short quizzes and activities that are embedded within those cartoons. So that's really testing engagement and comprehension. And then after completion, students get a copy of a summary sheet. And then the second part of the lesson is teacher facilitated activities. So we offer a range of different activities for teachers to pick from. So depending on delivery formats and preparation times, we've got things like worksheets, class discussions, role plays, some online interactive activities. And then teachers can also access their own lesson summaries, links to syllabus outlines, and implementation guides. So no formal teacher training is required, but it's quite a straightforward program. Slide. So as I mentioned, we rigorously evaluated the programs and they've generated extensive evidence to show that they work. So to date, we have conducted 9 randomised control trials to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. And this has included 280 schools and over 26,000 students across Australia. So as I mentioned, this is really the gold standard, or the top tier level of scientific evidence. Published on those in 70 peer-reviewed papers in some of the leading journals in our field. And there was also that pilot trial conducted in London, which found our futures to be feasible and acceptable there. Next slide. Across the trials, some of our key findings included demonstrated effectiveness in increasing knowledge about alcohol and other drugs, reducing alcohol consumption and binge drinking, reducing cannabis and ecstasy use, slowing the progression of anxiety and reducing psychological distress, reducing harms from substance use, reducing intentions to use substances, and improving attitudes towards alcohol. Next slide. We have also continued following up some of our study participants in long-term trials, so over about 7 years. And incredibly, we're seeing lasting effects of the interventions into early adulthood, with those that received our interventions being less likely to report binge drinking and alcohol-related harms up to 7 years later, so about age 20 at that point. Next slide. The programs have also been well received by students and teachers. So the vast majority of students found the cartoon stories to be an enjoyable and interesting way to learn. They felt that they were easy to understand and to remember, and teachers have highlighted the high educational quality of the program, rating it more favourably than other substance use and mental health programs. Slide. In addition to our own publications, the trials have been cited in a number of independent reviews examining the effectiveness of substance use prevention, one of which found our futures to be one of only 2 school-based alcohol and other drug education programs in Australia with a strong evidence base. Next slide. So we've now capitalised on that effective Our Futures model to apply it to vaping. So we're following that same format. We've got 4 interactive lessons, ideally delivered 1 week apart, with each lesson consisting of the web-based cartoon component, followed by the activities, got the summary sheets, And it's all following those same core principles of that social influence approach. So the evidence-based information about e-cigarettes and tobacco smoking, normative education to correct misperceptions on use, and resistance skills training. And I did say tobacco smoking too, because we take this integrated approach to simultaneously address both. So we're currently evaluating the efficacy and cost effectiveness of the programs in a cluster randomized control trial among year 7 and 8 students in 40 schools across New South Wales, WA and Queensland. And this is the first and currently the only rigorous evaluation of a school-based vaping prevention trial in Australia. However, the one downside to conducting such rigorous research is that it does take some time. So while the study is underway, we won't have results available until next year. I know there's a QR code on the slide after if you'd like to be kept across the results. And the Our Futures Institute is also running an early access scheme so that if you wanted to be among the first to access it, you can express your interest there. So I'll pass back over to Richard now.
Brilliant, Lauren, and thanks for the shout out to where to find more. It might be a reach in with your camera time and see if you can take a snapshot of the screen. But we can also make the materials from today available, and there'll be a video as well, folks. So if you've enjoyed this and want to check back, or if you've got colleagues that you want to share this stuff with, we'll have that out reasonably soon. I think the main thing to say for people that are joining us from Victoria is the Department of Education has funded through the school's mental health menu, your school to be able to access the programs that we've talked about today, particularly Our Futures, Preventure, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we can do around reviewing policies and practice to look at upskilling teachers and welfare workers, and even providing some of these messages to parents through information nights. I just wanted to let people know the 360 Edge website is a really good landing place if you want to jump off and either explore the resources or find out how you can get more support from us. However, we've got some Q&As coming through the chat. So in the couple of minutes left, I'm going to throw only the curliest of questions at our esteemed panelists today. And I guess the first one's probably the pragmatic question of what about this particular thing we're doing. So a question from Caitlin in the chat, vaping detectors becoming more popular in schools. Heard about them a fair bit in bathrooms in particular. Are these recommended, or are they part of that punitive response that you spoke about earlier, Nick, when you mentioned things like scanners? And I throw, possibly some other policies which come up pretty regularly, things like searching bags or having suspension or sent home from camp kind of policies. Nick, did you want to talk a little bit about where that sits?
Lauren, do you want to say something about that?
Sure. So from the evidence side of things, there is a lack of evidence behind those sorts of responses. So I would say that erring away from those punitive measures is the way to go. Students can further disengage from their education. It can exacerbate their vaping. So it'd be more beneficial if we were diverting those students to the educative interventions and treatment programs.
Maybe we'll pick up that comment around a treatment program, Lauren. I'm thinking about the universality of these programs, good health information, people making better decisions. What about students who've already made decisions to use, who perhaps have become dependent on nicotine via vapes, or perhaps are also experiencing mental health problems at the same time? What do we think about the best response for those kinds of kids?
The best response would definitely be diverting those to get professional support. So that would be through the local GP as the first port of call. There's quit lines, Kids Helpline, Headspace. We'd really want them to be getting that professional support there, as that's where the best evidence will be behind those treatments.
And
you spoke of, sorry, Nick, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say in relation, well, kind of tying those two things together, the use of detectors and those kind of punitive measures, not only is there not evidence for them, they're only, even if they were effective, they're only very first small step in detection. And if you don't have a response, an effective response post that, then you're letting those kids fall through the gaps, either through education or through referral to treatment, or having good policies about what happens next once you've detected someone is vaping on school grounds.
Lauren, we've spoken a bit about the detail of the curriculum in our futures, in the modules. I'm just wondering how your development of those modules was undertaken with respect to kind of national health curriculum guidance for schools. What's that alignment like?
Yeah, we make sure we're very closely aligned to that. So we co-designed these resources with teachers and educators, and we've had them mapped specifically to the national curriculum as well as the other state-based curriculums to ensure that all of the outcomes that we're achieving through these are very clear for teachers, and they can just seamlessly slide into their programming and tick the boxes for what they need to be teaching.
That sounds handy. Folks, I'm conscious of time. We've gone 1 minute over. I might say a big thank.
There's just a question, a short question there, Richard, about whether the state access in Victoria, I'm assuming that you mentioned, also includes independent schools. So this is a school's mental health menu that Richard was referring to. The Victorian government has given schools, it's kind of gone in tranches, and I'm not actually 100% sure where the tranches are up to, but the state government has given something like $28,000 to every school to access anything on this school's mental health menu and the Schools of Substance program that includes our futures and the policy development work, and that is on that school's menu.
Thanks, Nick. All right. Well, with an eye on the clock, a big thanks, Lauren and Nicole, for sharing your wisdom with us. A huge thanks to everyone that's come along. Thanks particularly for people that ask questions in the chat. Much appreciated. Keep your eyes open, folks. We'll post some links out with some content so that you can have another look at anything that we've discussed today, and keep your eyes peeled for the next webinar in the series. Thanks for joining us. Take care.